Scottish folk and fairy tales, Thom and Willie. Thom and Willie were two young fishermates from Luna in Shetland and were rivals for the hand of fair Osla, the daughter of Yarm. Now, it so happened one October afternoon they took their hand lines and were out fishing together on their boat. Toward dusk a wind rose, and it soon blew so hard as to compel the young man to run for the nearest shelter, a haven in the islet of Linga in Walsey Sound, which they happily reached in safety. The islet was uninhabited, and the fishermen had with them neither food nor the means of kindling a fire. They had, however, a roof over their heads, and for a hut or a lodge on the island, which was used by a fisherman in the fair weather season, but deserted since it was at the close of the period. The 2 days the storm raged without ceasing, and the last situation of the castaways began to grow very serious. However, in the morning of the third day, a little before daybreak, Willie, who was awake before his companion, discovered the weather had fared, and the wind blew in a favoring direction. Upon this, without rousing Tom, he proceeded to the boat, which lay safely hauled upon the shore, and by dint of great exertion managed to launch her single-handedly. Meantime, Tom awoke, and at last, as Willie did not come back, he followed him to the naust, or place where boats were drawn up. And here, at the sight that met him filled with dismay. The yawl had disappeared from her place, but raising his eyes, he beheld her already far out at sea and speeding before the breeze in the direction of Luna. At this sight, poor Tom gave way to despair. He realized that his comrade had basely and heartlessly deserted him, and he knew it was not likely that the islet would be visited until fishing season should come around again, and he had small hopes of help from any exertions to be made on his behalf, which might be made by friends, seeing that they would in ignorance where not know where to look for him. Amid melancholy thoughts and foreboding, the days slowly passed, and nightfall betook him, and he took himself back to the shakedown straw within the lodge. Darkness closed in, and he slept. But toward the small hours of the morning he was suddenly awakened, and with great astonishment to see the hut was lit up with a strange illumination, and whilst a queer inhuman hum and chatter, accompanied by the patter of many pairs of small feet, and jingle of gold and silver vessels, smote upon his ear. A fairy banquet was in fact in course of preparation in the lodge, and Tom raised himself noiselessly on his elbow and watched the proceedings. With infinite bustle and clatter, the table was at last laid, and then entered a party of trows, who bore between them a chair or a litter, and a female fairy, to whom they appeared to pay all their honour. The company took their seats, and the banquet was on the point of commencing, when, in the moment, the scene of festivity was changed into one of wild alarm and confusion. A moment more, and Tom learnt that, to his cost, the sudden change. The presence of a human being had been detected, and at a word from their queen, the grey people, swarming together, were about to rush upon the intruder. But in this trying juncture, Tom did not lose his presence of mind. He loaded the fowling piece by his side, and said to the fairies as they rushed upon him, and he raised it to his shoulder and fired. In an instant light was extinguished in all darkness, and silence and solitude. Let us now return to the perfidious Willie. Reaching Luna in safety, he related the tragic tale which he had invented on the voyage, to account for the absence of his comrade, and finding his story was believed, he began anew, without much loss of time, to urge his suit for the fair Osla. Her father, Yarm, regarded him with favour, but the maiden herself turned a deaf ear to all his entreaties. She felt she could not love him, and besides, she was haunted by the suspicion that Tom, in whose welfare she had felt a tender interest, had been victim of foul play. Pressure was, however, put upon her, and in spite of her objections, the early day was fixed for the wedding. The poor girl was in great distress. However, one night she had cried herself to sleep and dreamed a dream, the result of which the next morning she proceeded to the house of Tom's parents and begged them to join her in the search for their missing son. This, notwithstanding their love for him, they were somewhat reluctant to do, arguing that even supposing him to have been abandoned, as she divined, upon that rocky islet of the coast, he must have now perished from exposure and starvation. But the girl persisted in her entreaties, which at last prevailed. The boat was manned, and by Osla's direction was steered toward Linga, and upon approaching, sure enough, there the girl had predicted, they discovered that the islet had a human tenant. Thom met his friends on the beach, and was first eager greetings had passed, surprised and expressed at the freshness and robustness of his appearance. But this surprise was increased tenfold when, in recounting his adventures, he explained that during the latter days of his isolation he had been supported in life upon the remains of a scarcely tasted fairy banquet, adding that never in his life had he fared so delicately. And on their return to Luna, the party was received with rejoicing, and it was scarcely necessary to add that Thom and Ozla were soon made man and wife, and from that time forward Willie prospered no more. The loss of his health and fortune followed by that of his good name, and he sank ere long into an early and unregretted grave.